to Capacity Building Stories Climate Action 101, a podcast brought to you by the Paris Commune on Capacity Buildings Network in partnership with the United Nations University. I'm Eva Costas, your host, and in this series, we're breaking down the essentials of climate action, 101 style. Join us as we explore key concepts related to climate change while connecting the dots between capacity building, research, policy, and practical solutions. Let's dive in. Welcome to Accessing Climate Finance 101. Today's episode is all about mobilizing climate finance. Why building capacity is so critical for countries to access and deploy the resources needed to implement their NDCs and NAPs, where the biggest capacity gaps lie, and what's being done to close those gaps. Joining us today are two wonderful experts, Alejandro Kilpatrick and Serin Oh. Could you both start by introducing yourselves to our listeners?
Hello, my name is Alejandro Kilpatrick. I'm the manager of the Capacity Building Subdivision here at the UNFCCC Secretariat. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Serin Oh, and I'm a project associate in United Nations University, and I am focusing on climate disaster risk finance and policy. It's a pleasure to meet you all.
Wonderful. Welcome both, and thank you so much for joining us. So let's jump right in and start by looking at the bigger picture. So implementing nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans requires not only financial resources, but the capacity to access, manage, and redeploy those funds effectively. Why is capacity building such a critical part of mobilizing the resources needed to implement NDCs and NAPs?
Thank you for that question. Let me start. I think it's obvious now that money itself alone cannot solve the climate crisis. You may have a lot of money and a lot of resources flowing into countries or projects, but without strong institutions, skilled people, and robust systems, even that finance, if it's available, will be either not effectively used or deployed ineffectively. We've seen examples of that where finance it is there, but then it has to be reallocated because there are not the necessary capacities or skills to be able to implement actions. Just to give you as an example, less than half of countries in the world, 67 out of 144, who have initiated the NAP process, the National Adaptation Plan process, have submitted their NAP. Only 67 out of 144. This is clearly a gap related to capacities. Countries don't have enough capacities to develop and implement a NAP that can be investable and can lead to implementation on the ground. So capacity building is fundamental because of several points. First is the gateway. Countries need mostly for accessing finance, accredited institutions that meet the standards of financial management, safeguards, and fiduciary requirements. Capacity is needed there to get these institutions up to speed. Secondly, capacity, the level of capacity determines what happens after the money arrives. Like I mentioned, even with a lot of funding, countries need technical skills, be able to develop feasibility studies, to understand how to structure blended finance, for example, or do climate risk assessments, and develop business plans. These capacities often are not there or they need to be strengthened. And basically, without these capabilities, money cannot translate into projects on the ground. Also, capacity building creates the so-called enabling environment for transformation. So it sets the basis for this transformation in a more longer term and sustained manner. For example, if you look at the latest adaptation gap report, the finance gap, just the finance gap is between $187 and $359 billion per year. This means that, and for an issue like adaptation, strong coordination mechanisms between ministries, and I mean all ministries, technical ministries, but also ministries of planning, ministries of finance, it's fundamental. We've seen examples where climate finance units are being created to prioritize investments and help establish monitoring systems to track impact. This creation of these climate finance units needs to be anchored on building the skills and knowledge of whoever is going to run these climate finance units. So that's an important capacity building area. So without this, we tend to get this fragmented project. Without this coordination between ministries, we see these fragmented projects that are focusing only on the one sector or only one priority instead of what is needed, this systemic transformation to really address the adaptation challenge in developing countries. But on the good side, capacity building is very cost effective. Strategic investments in what is called readiness and capacity building have a leveraging effect because they facilitate larger project approvals and enable countries to access multiple funding sources. For example, if you build capacities, not targeting only one specific fund, but rather the whole ecosystem of available resources, that capacity can help countries access different sources. But it's very important that the issue of sustaining these capacities. So not only relying on short-term capacity building, but more on trained personnel, institutional systems, and coordination mechanisms that continue delivering value long after individual projects or after individual capacity building efforts have concluded. The PCCB, the Paris Committee on Capacity Building 2025 focus area, actually captures this perfectly. We need capacity for holistic investment strategies, for development of bankable projects, and for effective stakeholder engagement. Without that, we are asking countries to implement ambitious NDCs and NAPs, basically with one hand tied behind their backs. So the Paris Committee on Capacity Building is exploring how to help countries and stakeholders exchange information and knowledge and resources to move forward in the building those capacities in a more country-owned and sustained manner. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Alejandro really mentioned the most important part and the most important points in terms of capacity building. So maybe I can just add and also reiterate why we need capacity building and why it's not like an optional thing. I think everyone knows that climate finance is not sufficient, and especially to meet the mitigation and adaptation goals in many developing countries, and to make the national adaptation plans and NDCs into real actions, not only to develop, but also to implement them. So I think that really highlights why strategic allocation is important, because we have limited resources. So we have to allocate these resources into impactful projects. So funds need to go to the most vulnerable sectors and the most impactful programs. As Alejandro already mentioned, many developing countries are lacking this skill sets to actually making impactful projects and identify what is the most vulnerable sectors. So there are various types of capacity gaps, such as institutional, technical, or just systemic capacity in the countries. So I think in that sense, capacity building had been considered as an optional thing. Maybe finance needs to go first, and then we talk about capacity building. But actually, this is something that needs to go in parallel, or even capacity building needs to come first before the finance or project implement. So I think this kind of the entire international climate policy and finance scheme just highlights why capacity building is a most essential part of this discussion. I think I will stop here.
Thank you both so much. I think you've really laid the foundation that capacity building provides and how it should really be seen as not optional and almost as non-negotiable, really, when it comes to also mobilizing climate finance. But even with that foundation, and the both of you already touched upon it slightly, we know countries still face barriers when trying to translate finance into real climate action. So could you elaborate a bit more on the main capacity gaps or challenges that countries face in accessing climate finance and turning it into concrete investment strategies or projects?
Thank you. I think Serin already mentioned some of the gaps at different levels, because we have systemic gaps that cut across sectors and institutions that would allow for a more integrated addressing of the access in finance issue. But we also have, and those are sort of addressing the systemic gaps, necessarily need to be substantiated or be supported by addressing the institutional and also individual gaps. As Serin mentioned, institutional gaps are a key that's hindering more effective access to finance. And because, like we mentioned before, climate finance governance is fragmented. When I say it's fragmented from the perspective of governments, where different institutions are involved, but also from the perspective of donors and collaborators, when you have multiple agencies with overlapping mandates, but different incentives. And I think that's an element that has to be addressed from the perspective of how do you integrate climate considerations into overall planning and budgeting across ministries. For example, the engagement of ministries of finance early on is fundamental. And that's an area also of awareness raising and capacity building to be able to get the ministries of finance and planning engaged and understand from their perspective how addressing climate change or supporting the implementation of a NAP or NDC also has social and economic returns. That's one aspect. Also, in terms of institutional gaps, we see that the national designated authorities, those are institutions that have the possibility of accessing several multilateral funds. Often they lack the capacity to coordinate across ministries of finance, again, planning, civil society, and private sector, because when you're developing programs and projects, these national designated entities are the ones responsible to make sure everyone's on board and that it's well articulated. And we see that often they face capacity gaps and needs. Something that I also want to mention when it comes to institutional capacities is the issue of rotation. So institutions change, governments change, people change, and sometimes it's easy to lose those capacities that have been installed. So we're seeing that how to support institutions in countries so that those capacities are retained and are sort of safeguarded against these normal institutional changes as much as possible. So that could be through an institutionalized capacity building effort in the institutions, or relying on national entities that provide training for government officials, which are common in various countries. There, of course, also those are the institutional gaps. We will also have the technical gaps that are almost often related to individual capacities. So technical capacity gaps could include lack of disaggregated climate data, ability to do projections that are scaled to local levels. For example, we see limited expertise in climate science, vulnerability assessment, which is a big gap for developing sound adaptation projects. But also in the context of finance, we see a lot of gaps in the so-called innovative finance instrument, how to understand these instruments, how to see how they work and how to apply them to different contexts at the national, local level. When we talk about green bonds, blended finance, microfinance, etc. I think countries, despite all the support has been provided, are still struggling to developing bankable projects because of the high transaction cost, and there's often a weak ability to demonstrate investment readiness. When I say investment readiness, it's not the same as bankability. Bankability is making a project attractive enough to receive investment. And sometimes we confuse bankability with eligibility. So there are capacity gaps there. And we see, for example, in the context of NDCs and NAPs, that often these instruments are not costed when submitted, particularly NAPs. So it's not clear how much investment will be needed. And here it goes back to the issue of application processes are complex, labor intensive, but there has been also a bit of an over-reliance on these fly-in, fly-out modalities, which are very useful and have helped countries a lot accessing multilateral funds mainly, but I think efforts should be strengthened to build this country capacity, country ownership and locally led capacity building interventions. Conclude on this, I think it's an important capacity development area is how to engage effectively the private sector. And when I say private sector, it's the whole scope of private sector, not just large multinationals, but also small and medium-sized enterprises, which in most developing countries constitute the bulk of private sector activity. And these entities play an important role and could play an important role in supporting the advancing activity supporting NDCs and NAPs if they're also given the right, of course, incentive, which is a policy issue, but also if their capacities are strengthened.
Yeah, maybe I can add some more based on my experiences, where I have been focusing on like climate risk finance and related policy, especially when I talk with developing countries. As Alejandro mentioned, I think it is really important to all of these gaps. I think it is really important to integrate or elaborate it in their NAPs and NDCs on how much investment, what kind of investments, and what kind of interventions and financial instruments can be included to actually make these actions possible. So, for example, there are many countries already listed some sort of interventions in their NAPs and NDCs, but they actually don't know how much it will cost and what would be the most cost-effective and impactful way to implement this. So I think this is one of the biggest gaps that many countries are facing. And this also links to their technical capacity gap, because the countries don't have data or they don't know how to utilize data into develop like a risk profile or identify their climate risks comprehensively. And also this link to systematic gap, because many times some climate investments or climate projects are not sustainable. It does not provide long-term and long-lasting impacts. And if the countries only develop like one-time projects, this will not attract private investment nor international donors, because it does not prove like a long-lasting impact. So it's not good for the countries as well. So I think the way that countries really have to develop and implement in a actionable way with how much, how, and why, and more details. I think this is the gaps that I want to highlight.
Thank you both so much for really breaking that down into the technical and individual, institutional, systemic level. And I think these gaps really show how complex the finance and climate landscape can be. But looking on a more opposite positive note, there's also a lot of innovation, research, and collaboration that's emerging to tackle these challenges. So would you be able to share some promising approaches that you've seen in your work to address these gaps and challenges and essentially strengthen the capacity to mobilize climate finance more effectively?
Yes, one important solution that I like to highlight is climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, or CDRFI. So just to briefly introduce, CDRFI tools are financial mechanisms or strategies arranged ahead of shocks. So they help protect individuals, communities, or governments from economic impacts of climate-related disasters. So they can also strengthen disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and response of the countries. As we're discussing NDCs and NAPs, CDRFI can actually play a key supporting role. So when they are integrated into these national frameworks like NDCs and NAPs, risk financing can enhance both the development and implementation of climate interventions. So this ensures that financial protection is embedded within broader adaptation strategies, so that these adaptation investment options can be more bankable. So I can give you a bit more specific example. So a strong example of this integration is Nigeria. So in Lagos, UNDP, collaborating with Insurance Development Forum and Lagos State Government, is actually supporting the development of parametric flood insurance scheme. So this product is designed to protect up to 4 million people by providing financial support when severe flooding occurs. And this is based on satellite floods data. And also building on this, UNDP is supporting the government of Nigeria to scale this initiative nationally and to develop a national disaster finance, which can strengthen the country's financial resilience and climate related shocks. And all of these efforts and interventions are actually closely linked to Nigeria's NDC 3.0. So in the country's NDC 3.0, it highlights the importance of integrating climate insurance into country's broader adaptation strategy and developing CGI-5 products. And also, the NDC commits to embedding monitoring and evaluation indicators such as insurance coverage into its reporting and transparency frameworks. And this is also linked to the country's data capacity and technical capacity, which we previously discussed. And if you look at the global level, UNDP and MCII under UNU, we have developed supplementary guidelines on how to integrate CDFI into national adaptation plans. So it can provide policymakers a pragmatic and a step-by-step framework for linking CGFI mechanisms into national adaptation planning. So in summary, all of these examples shows how financial instruments like CGFI and climate policy can come together in helping countries to respond faster and also build lasting resilience to climate shocks and develop a bit more bankable and strong and effective adaptation interventions and investment options.
Thank you. I think, Serin, you provide very concrete and very encouraging examples, particularly when using instruments that can be seen as complex, but can yield interesting or positive results, like using insurance-related instruments, which also are related to how do you understand and build the capacities to deploy them. Maybe just to add a bit of examples. So when we talk about boosting institutional capacity, and here we're basically, again, going to the basic principles that I think are important, like ensuring country ownership and looking at interventions that help retain capacities to make sure those capacities are sustained over time and help countries advance in this case, mobilizing and accessing finance. For example, for boosting institutional capacities, first of all, I think countries' capacities must be built to build and maintain strong direct assets entities, and also to help build the capacities of coordination bodies across ministries to work horizontally. For example, Kenya's Climate Change Council, which is basically looking at how through this council, all institutions are working together to align with the objectives of Kenya's climate strategies and instruments. Another way would be to build capacity for climate budget tracking, which is in governments, such as with IBJEC's tagging system. This is might sound very technical, but it's a very useful instrument to be able to understand what are the flows, how to tag them, how to track them, and also for future planning and further integration of climate action into planning and budgeting processes. When it comes to improving technical and human capacity, we have seen examples where embedding experts in agencies, local, national agencies, experts on climate finance or climate in general, actually is a very good initiative and avoids this over-reliance of fly-out consultants. So embed these experts in key institutions, which can be combined with enabling South-to-South peer-to-peer learning, which is proving to be a very successful way of also connecting experts and countries that face similar issues, but have advanced in solving them and can transmit those skills, knowledge, and capacities to other countries. Something that we also have seen is the importance of building talent pipelines. But yeah, universities is another promising approach. I think universities and local universities and research organizations are a key actor to further engage and strengthen because they have longer permanence in the countries are the main mission is to develop this talent. For example, the Bangladesh Climate Cell, which is being implemented by Dhaka University. And this cell is actually embedded in the Ministry of Finance, which is quite innovative. So you have this talent supported by university, embedded in climate and Ministry of Finance to promote that integration and access to finance. And last but not least, it is important that climate action can be taken locally. And here, the importance of training local governments on participatory planning, embedding climate action is fundamental. And we have several examples through the local program, for example, in Mozambique, which is empowering these local governments, not only on planning, but on securing financial resources from different sources. So, like I mentioned earlier, the engagement of the private sector is also fundamental. Not only the engagement, but also to be able to speak to the private sector in their own language, if I may use that term. And also that requires some level of capacity building. So I think that that's also fundamental. So as a bottom line, I would say that we need to shift from training events to institutionalized systems. So avoid these isolated training workshops, which are very helpful, no doubt about it, but move more to institutionalized systems that work over a longer period of time. Countries with sustained support can prepare better plans and have a better chance to manage the humongous challenge ahead and a better chance to also access and mobilize finance, not only from the usual funds, but rather from a wide range of sources.
Thank you both so much for the insightful inputs. It's very interesting because we started off this conversation with the both of you highlighting that money alone cannot solve the climate crisis and capacity building being the gateway to climate finance. And you've really proven through all your various different examples and insights that it really is the combination of resources, skills, institutional capacity, enabling environments, the full set of means of implementation really that enables effective climate action. So just to wrap up the episode, wanted to check in if the two of you had any final messages or food for thought to share with the listeners.
I want to highlight how comprehensive risk management can help the overall development and implementation of NDCs and NAPs. So that would be my last key takeaway.
Thank you. On my side, again, I would like to emphasize that the work of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building is undertaking under its focus area. Like I mentioned, it's on capacity building for designing holistic investment strategies, bankable projects, and stakeholder engagement, which is really advancing in getting all these good examples, good practices, disseminate them, but also how this committee can use its work to inform the UNFCCC process at the intergovernmental level so that parties can have a better grasp of what are effective ways to address the current and emerging capacity gaps and needs. And we're very encouraged about also the collaboration with the United Nations University through the UN Academy that will take place during the next session of the Conference of the Parties in Belém, Brazil. So please do join us at the 7th Capacity Building Hub in Belém. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. And also to flag for our listeners, we'll be including any relevant resources on the description box below on the PCCB's work, but obviously as well on this Serin's work around CDRFI. And we also have another episode that might be of interest that dives a lot deeper into the topic. Thank you both again for your time, for sharing all your insights and for all your knowledge. And thank you, obviously, for our listeners for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode and we'll see you on the next one.